People in this city were living very different lives. A minority were comfortable and well-fed, enjoying the advantages of technology and transit. But the rest of society felt the rug being pulled out from under their feet again and again. They did what they needed to get by, but knew hungry times that left a lasting impact on the bodies of their growing children. This vast inequality brought deep unrest. Riots and the fear of riots were met with crackdowns in the streets, the major public spaces of the city where all of these people met. This was life in Gilded Age Philadelphia, and we're about to get up close and personal with the people who lived there. This is Found in Philadelphia, a podcast dedicated to telling the stories of Philadelphia's past so that we can better understand the present. Because our history matters. I'm your host, Lori Ament. With each episode, I hope that you'll learn something new, see things a little differently, and be inspired to go discover some of this history for yourself, right here in the city of brotherly love. In this episode, we're going to poke and pry into the lives of the people walking the streets of Philadelphia in the Gilded Age. This is the first in a two-part mini-series. In this episode, we'll try to understand the middle and working classes in Philadelphia. I'm happy to say that you'll be hearing from Professor Michael Kahn, co-director of the program on urban studies at Stanford University. I know it takes a while for me to release each episode, so if you're curious about what's going on with the podcast in between episodes, you can sign up for the podcast newsletter at our website, foundinphiladelphia.com. The Gilded Age in America is roughly the period from the 1870s to about 1900. This was a time of economic turmoil, increased poverty, and rising wealth inequality. But during these decades, Philadelphia was expanding. The city's population doubled, growing from over 600,000 people in 1870 to over 1.2 million by 1900. And that growth came from an influx of increasingly diverse immigrants. People from Ireland and Germany were now joined by Italian families, Jewish refugees from Russia and Eastern Europe, and men from China. Foreign-born residents made up about 25% of the city's population. And during this period of growth, Philly's Black community also increased because of migrants who were coming here from the South. And because of this migration, even as the city grew, Black residents remained a steady 4% of the city. And Philly was building to house this growing population. The city laid out new streets, and people lined these streets with new row houses. These decades of development made Philly the city of row homes that we know today. The downtown along Market and Chestnut Streets was a magnet for shoppers as huge new department stores competed for customers, each department store larger and more elaborate than the last. Major civic projects also shaped the city, from the massive City Hall standing at its center to the sprawling Fairmount Park snaking along the Schuylkill River to the northwest. The street served as a conduit for new infrastructure and technology. Wires looped overhead from pole to pole, powering the telegraph and later the telephone and electric trolleys. Under the streets, pipes brought gas and water to some residents' homes and carried away wastewater. Philly in the Gilded Age was starting to look like a city that we might recognize today. But what about the people who lived there? If you strolled down Market Street in the late 19th century, you'd rub elbows with a cross-section of Philly society. White men in long black suit jackets, tall bowler hats, and walking sticks stride down the streets. White women with fantastic feathered hats climb on and off the clanging trolleys that run down the middle of the street. Fashionable women in well-tailored dresses peer into shop windows, holding the hands of their well-dressed children. Peddlers sell from creaking, horse-drawn wagons overflowing with woven baskets. Women servants in black bonnets and long white aprons swish by, carrying these same baskets to market. Workmen with wooden wheelbarrows heave broken paving stones along the street. Brightly painted, horse-drawn delivery carts trot by groups of boys in short pants who are sitting on upturned boxes. Men in vests, shirt sleeves, and broad-brimmed hats call out to each other as they shift wooden crates and barrels. A Chinese man loaded with laundry keeps his head down as he crosses the street. Messenger boys hustle past young Jewish girls in headscarves selling cough drops. On the street corner, an Italian man and his daughter sell sweet-smelling fruit, while a black man in rolled-up shirt sleeves, suspenders, and a Stetson rests on a curb. Newsboys hawking newspapers are ignored by the men smoking cigars who lounge against telegraph poles. A young boy shines shoes next to a man claiming to be a Civil War veteran. One of his arms is amputated, while the other reaches out for charity. A blind man cranks out a bright piping tune on a barrel organ, and a small girl in a torn check dress begs for a nickel. A policeman strolls past with double rows of shining brass buttons on his long blue coat. So who exactly were all of these people that we just met in the street? First, let's take a look at those well-dressed people who are shopping and riding the streetcars. These were the members of the middle class. They were families who were comfortable financially, but didn't aspire to high society. There's a lot of dispute about this, but the middle class was estimated to be anywhere from 3 to 10% of the total population. Men tended to work non-manual professional jobs that earned a salary. They worked as clerks, managers, doctors, or lawyers, or they owned small businesses or factories. Most of them voted Republican and had staunchly supported the Union during the war. They earned enough money to be able to live at a distance from where they worked and could afford to commute on streetcars or trains while still having a little left over to save in the bank. Middle-class women were responsible for the domestic sphere, managing the home and raising the children, typically with the assistance of servants and maybe even a nanny. These women didn't work for wages, but they often dedicated significant amounts of their time volunteering. Middle-class families had fewer children, so they must have used some form of birth control to keep their families small. They valued family, education, hard work, thrift, sobriety, and civic duty. Boys attended private schools, girls were taught at home. Both were supported through an extended childhood that we now call adolescence. Most young men and some women attended high school and might have had a college education as well. The majority of middle-class families in Philly were white and Protestant, but some were Catholic, some were Jewish, and Philly had a significant Black middle class as well. They were professionals working as teachers, doctors, lawyers, and clerks, and they accounted for about 11% of the total Black population. In the Gilded Age, the middle class increasingly lived in outlying suburban-style developments that were being built in the northern and western areas of the city. Picture neighborhoods like Powelton Village and Chestnut Hill East. Here, large single-family homes and twins with generous porches were set back from tree-lined streets. In these outlying areas, middle-class families ran on the schedule of the commuter train or the streetcar. Men traveled to Center City to work. Women rode the same trains to do their shopping. Families took outings by the train to resorts like Atlantic City. The streetcars and train cars were relatively expensive to ride, so they were effectively respectable middle-class spaces. Trains and streetcars were considered so safe that women could ride on their own all day and into the evening without a male chaperone. Now, as the middle classes rode these rails from home into the store or to the park, they helped to reshape Philadelphia from the 1870s and into the 20th century. They created new zones within an expanded city that catered to specialized uses for the middle class to live, work, and play. The middle class strived to create order out of the chaos of the jumbled-together Gilded Age city where there were no zoning laws. They were driven by their understanding of science as a process of organization and classification, not science as a method of experimentation as we think of it today. They thought there was a place for everything and everything in its place. Residential areas over here, commercial activities clustered over there, and manufacturing somewhere else. They had faith that their science organization could improve society's problems, and they extended this belief to the separation of classes and physical space as well. They really felt that this was inevitable and even necessary for cities to function. So more and more, the middle class was living in their own neighborhoods, separate from the working class, which was pretty much everybody else in the city. The overwhelming majority of Philadelphians in the late 19th century were considered working class. And this was a hugely complex group of people that included families of skilled craftsmen who had regular work and lived in street upon street of newly built row houses. Some even had indoor plumbing. It also included laboring families where parents and children all needed to work to make ends meet. And it included the vulnerable poor who got by on temporary work and assistance from charity. The poor crammed into tiny homes in the back alleys of the older sections of the city where there was no running water. But there were no hard boundaries between these groups. Remember, there were 3 economic panics that rocked the Gilded Age in 1873, 1883, and again in 1893. And working families often found themselves slipping from being stable to just scraping by. Let's talk about a few general things we can say about the working class at this time. The working classes would categorize themselves as being, quote, respectable or rough. This wasn't a financial distinction so much as a classification based on behavior. Respectable families were different from rough families because they valued work over idleness, sobriety over drunkenness, and restraint over violence. They had standards for the care of children, which meant proper feeding, cleaning, and clothing, and not allowing them to roam the streets all day and night. The respectable working class saw merit in the struggle to make ends meet. The father who was never home because he was out doing extra work. The mother who took in washing from a brothel house. The families who sent their children out to work instead of sending them to school. These were all considered respectable sacrifices made for the sake of the family. The working class lived in different conditions in neighborhoods all over the city, but they all needed to live within walking distance of where they worked. Even though the city was covered in streetcar rails, the working class couldn't afford to ride transit every day. So they walked. Neighborhoods were more likely to be defined by the type of work people did than by their ethnic identity because everyone walked to work. Railroad workers lived within walking distance of the rail yards. Textile workers lived close by the mill. And for many Philadelphians, the street was the place where they made their living. For this reason, many of the poorest of the working classes needed to live nearby the busy streets of Market and Chestnut in Center City. Working class life in Philly revolved around the factories, commercial centers, and shops that were in this walking distance from home. Now, within the working class neighborhoods where people lived, a great deal of domestic activity happened on the stoop, in the rear yard, and on the street. Here's urban studies professor Michael Kahn from Stanford University.
Lower income people, for one thing, have less access to indoor space. They tend to live in smaller dwellings, and there's less space for them to carry on their lives indoors. They also have less access to certain technologies like indoor plumbing that make it easier for wealthy people to stay in their houses. So poor people have to go outside to get water. They have to go outside to use the bathroom in many cases. And they have to go outside if they want any, privacy or chance to be apart from their, immediate household residents.
And people lived on top of one another, and everyone within the neighborhood knew each other's business. But there was also a fierce protectiveness to take care of your own. Working-class neighborhoods were often watched by groups of young men and boys who patrolled the streets to discourage outsiders from entering. Okay, so now let's take a closer look at this huge, unwieldy group that we're calling the working class. Because not everyone was having the same experience in the Gilded Age. First, the majority of the working class were white and born in the United States. These were families who relied on skilled, manual work to make a living. Many of these families lived in the newly built row houses that Philadelphia was becoming famous for, though most could only afford to rent. Their children attended public school some of the time. These tended to be the better off of the working class. But even among these families, there was a lot of anxiety. Society was changing in the decades following the Civil War. With all the economic downturns and the expansion of factory work, white working-class men began to see fewer and fewer opportunities to open their own shops and be their own boss, which had historically been the goal. In the future, it was much more likely that these men were going to be working for someone else their entire lives, and that stung. On top of that, laboring men were less and less likely to be able to support their families with their wages alone. So more and more white women were entering the workforce as wage earners, and having married women work out of the house was a blow to the image of the working man as the provider. In white families, whenever possible, the children were sent out to work to earn wages, and the wives stayed and worked pretty hard at home. White children typically started to work in their early teens, though in desperate times, very young children were sent out to sell newspapers or fruit, to serve as messenger boys. Some were sent out to beg or to scavenge along the streets and railroad tracks for coal and wood. Parents expected their children to hand over their wages to help support the family. During the Gilded Age, white working families became more and more reliant on having both children and women earn wages outside of the home. In the decades from 1870 to 1890, the number of women and children in the labor force doubled, and Philly was even more dependent on the labor of women and children than other American cities because of its heavy concentration of textile factories. In 1880, it was estimated that almost half of Philly's textile workers were women. Our city had the highest percentage of families with 2 working parents, higher than any other industrialized city in the United States. It was increasingly rare that a single male breadwinner could provide for an entire family. Now, if the white working class was struggling, what was the situation for the Black working class during the Gilded Age? For Black residents, life was even more precarious. And we have an extraordinary record of the Black community in Philly during this period because of the pioneering work of W.E.B. Du Bois, whose work was published as The Philadelphia Negro in 1899. According to Du Bois, most of the Black population, about 56% to be exact, were what he considered the respectable poor. Du Bois describes them as ambitious. In contrast to white residents, Black parents tended to keep their children at home. These families prioritized some form of schooling for both boys and girls, at least up to the age of 16. And the younger population had extremely high literacy rates. It was the women of the family who worked outside of their own homes. The vast majority of these working women were domestic workers. They worked in other people's homes. And that's because the only jobs really open to Black people were lower-paying service jobs. So they worked as porters, waiters, cooks, laundry workers, servants, and cleaners. They also faced discriminatory housing practices. Black families were charged high rents to live where they could walk to the wealthier parts of the city to work in hotels, restaurants, and private homes. And in order to afford those rents, families took in lodgers or settled together in cramped living conditions. Du Bois noted that the Black community lived mostly concentrated in the 7th Ward, which was a long strip of blocks to the south of Center City. And they lived here partly out of necessity, but also out of a desire to be near each other and their churches and community centers that were established there. So this was the group that Du Bois classified as the respectable poor. But Du Bois estimated that a third of the Black population lived in deep poverty, those that Du Bois called the, quote, poor and unfortunate. In good times, these families were just able to make ends meet, and they suffered most when times were bad. Many of them were migrants from Maryland and Virginia, moving to Philadelphia in search of a better life. They lived in the densely packed blocks to the south of Center City, near the Delaware docks. They crowded into the small back alley streets, or in the blind alleys leading off of back alleys. And Black families shared these crowded, unsanitary housing conditions with newly arrived immigrants. Many of the newest immigrants were Jewish families who were fleeing oppression and violence in Russia. The number of Jewish residents in Philadelphia exploded from 5,000 in 1880 to over 40,000 by 1890, when they made up nearly 4% of the total population. These back alley streets also absorbed workers coming from Italy. Italian immigration to Philly had been slow, but began to pick up in the 1880s, and then increased to a flood in the 1890s, with Italian immigrants making up 1% of the city's population by the turn of the century. So you had Black, Jewish, and Italian residents all trying to make new lives for themselves in the back streets of Southwest Philadelphia. Let's take a look at what life was like for these poorest of the poor during the Gilded Age. It was crowded. It's estimated that 1/10 of the city's residents crammed into these blocks, which were only 1/80th of the city's total area. And these residents lived packed in next to smoking factories, food smells from small shops, and manure piles scraped from stables. They were also close by the notorious red light area called the Alaska District. It was named after Alaska Street, which was so notorious that they later renamed it, and we know it as Cater Street. The residents of these streets were blamed for bringing disease. Many, including the city's Bureau of Health, blamed the Black and immigrant inhabitants for the pollution and contagion in the neighborhoods, claiming that it could only be cleaned by, quote, moral reform. Now, it's true that these were the most densely populated blocks in the city, and the families living here did have the highest mortality rates in this period, with residents dying of contagious diseases like pneumonia, measles, cholera, and scarlet fever. But many, like W.E.B. Du Bois, put the blame on social and economic pressures that forced so many people to live in these blocks. And let's not forget the poor sanitation and lack of city services, because the sanitary conditions in these back streets were abysmal. Du Bois wrote about one blind alley where multiple families rented 6 small houses and shared only 2 outhouses. Okay, so that's about 1 bathroom for 6 families. And these outhouses were accessible to anyone else who happened by. And even if houses did have indoor facilities, they were often not connected to the public sewer directly. Typically, household wastewater and sewage drained into a shared privy vault underneath the street and just accumulated there. Or this waste was flushed directly onto the street, where it was supposed to drain along the gutters to a street drain. The families who lived in these back streets rarely received city services. Few of these backstreet homes had running water, so residents got their water from a shared public hydrant, and the streets were covered in trash, with ashes and garbage piled up in the tiny rear yards, because regular trash collection didn't happen here. Only a few rear alleys had any street lighting, and if they did, they were lit with a single gas lamp. But despite the conditions, the rent for these back houses was surprisingly high. And these back alleys were also full of animals. Many of these poor families came from rural backgrounds and raised livestock on Philly's streets. Some kept chickens, geese, ducks, and goats. One home reportedly had 30 sheep kept on the 2nd story of the house. The sheep were driven up there along an incline runway, and then the sheep were brought downstairs when it was time to be butchered. The butcher and his family lived in the same building in the front rooms. This was just everyday life in these back alley neighborhoods. Now, another small but significant immigrant community was forming to the north of Center City during the Gilded Age, establishing the neighborhood we now call Chinatown. Chinese immigrants began coming to Philly in the 1870s. The community counted just 13 men in 1870, but grew to nearly 1,200 by the turn of the century. During this period, they were mostly men trying to escape from racial violence in the American West after being brought to the United States to help build the Transcontinental Railroad. These workers formed a tight-knit community on the 900 block of Race Street. Even though the Chinese community in Philly was small in the 19th century, their mere presence fueled racist, anti-Chinese rhetoric. They had few job opportunities besides working as servants, running laundries, or setting up other small shops. But these Chinese men created a community here. They built their own banks, hospitals, shops, and gathering places, often on the upper floors where they were more protected. They created a safe space for Asian immigrants to transition to life in America, something that Chinatown continues to do today. So we've looked at the different lifestyles and living conditions of the middle class and the very diverse group of people that made up the working classes of the Gilded Age. But I came across a book by Robert Dirks called Food in the Gilded Age: What Ordinary Americans Ate, and it offers a really visceral way to understand the huge gaps between rich and poor in this period by looking at what they ate. So let's take a little culinary diversion here. In the Gilded Age, middle-class families could afford to eat a wide variety of foods throughout the year. They ate better cuts of meat, especially beef, and they typically ate it every day. They supplemented seasonal fruits and vegetables with canned goods, or they could buy vegetables that were farmed in the South or West and then brought to the city by train. They ate tomatoes and spinach from the South, and later oranges and apricots from California. The middle class was also eating packaged baked goods and trying the newfangled breakfast cereals like Wheatina. Generally, the working classes often could only purchase small quantities of food at a time from neighborhood shops. They made do with cheaper cuts of meat, like chops, pudding, sausages, liver. They would stretch their money by buying cracked eggs and recycling leftover meat into hashes and croquettes. And they used butter substitutes like margarine and products called butterine and cottolene. They bought bread from a bakery to save on the fuel costs at home. Fresh fruit and vegetables were the first items to be dropped when money was tight, especially during the winter. They drank little milk because milk sold in the cities often carried diseases and was adulterated with additives like chalk. So the working classes often preferred canned, sweetened, condensed milk, which was a multitasker that could be used in place of milk, sugar, and butter. Of course, each of the different working class communities that we've talked about had their own unique eating patterns. Black families up north ate more like Northerners, but were unique in eating sweet potatoes as a staple. Jewish families from Russia ate gingerbread and beets. Italians splurged on the relatively expensive olive oil, cornmeal, and pasta. Chinese men found that their traditional foods like tripe were quite cheap in the U.S. Many immigrants ate meager diets, especially when compared to the middle class, but they were still eating much better in America than they had in their home country. The kinds of foods they ate on a daily basis here would have only been available as a special festive meal at home. But historical studies show that the amount of calories consumed by families in the Gilded Age was just as unequal as income. The middle class ranked at the top, the skilled working class in the middle, and the unskilled working families at the bottom. Even though the working poor were more likely to be engaged in manual labor and expended the most amount of energy in their daily lives. Working class families experienced seasonal fluctuations in their nutrition. This means that they often struggled through hungry months each year. And this has been documented in the stunted growth of America's working class children in the late 19th century. In the winter, poor families' calorie intake dropped by 10 to 20% in northern cities. Part of the problem was a drop in work during the winter months, but it was also typical for food prices to spike in the winter. In contrast, the middle classes were eating more milk and dairy during the winter and increasing the calories they took in. Perhaps it's not surprising that being plump was a marker of beauty and status in the Gilded Age. Very few in the working class could achieve it. All right, we've explored Philadelphia in the Gilded Age. We peered into people's windows, inspected their toilets, judged their child-rearing habits, and even calculated the calorie count of their dinners. Part of the reason we can do this is because we've been following in the footsteps of middle-class reformers who wrote about it. The middle class were not oblivious to the immense inequalities between their comfortable lives and the vast majority of the working class. They could see it every day in the streets. And the middle classes were intensely uneasy about what they called the, quote, dangerous class, and they wanted to study them. They brought their ideas of science, remember, as a way to organize and classify things, to understand the problem of the working classes, because there was a very real fear that these people, pushed to the brink, might rise up in class warfare. These fears were stoked by a very active, organized labor movement, which fought to improve working conditions. In fact, the streets of Gilded Age Philadelphia were full of striking workers. This was an era of intense labor unrest. People struggled through waves of high unemployment, reduced wages, and long working hours, while the rich just seemed to get richer. It's not surprising that labor was organizing and taking to the streets in this period. The United States had an estimated 9,000 labor strikes in the 1880s and over 13,000 strikes in the 1890s. But while labor strikes were highly visible uprisings, the actual power of unions was limited. As an example, in Philadelphia, only about 10% of workers belonged to a union by 1900. But these labor protests stoked the anxieties of the wealthy, who feared a radical worker revolution, like the uprising of the Paris Commune in the spring of 1871, which ended with fighting in the streets and thousands dead. So they responded with violent crackdowns against unions, bringing in local police, the National Guard, and sometimes federal troops to break the strikes. One of the largest strikes of the Gilded Age was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. This was a difficult time of economic depression following the Panic of 1873. Many people were out of work. Railroad companies planned to cut workers' wages by 10%. And it's fairly clear that the railroad companies colluded to all cut wages at the same time. A protest by workers on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in West Virginia sparked protests against the Pennsylvania Railroad in Pittsburgh. The Philadelphia militia was called in to put down the strike in Pittsburgh, ending in the militia shooting and killing 40 people, including a woman and 3 small children. The protesters retaliated by burning as much railroad property as they could. 3 Philadelphia militia members were killed as well. Following this violence, waves of general strikes against the railroads were called across the country. A day after the events in Pittsburgh, in late July 1877, the engineers of the Pennsylvania Railroad struck at the 30th and Market Street yards here in Philadelphia. They were supported by over 1,000 sympathizers. There was panic in the nearby wealthy neighborhoods in West Philly. Public meetings were banned. 1,300 city policemen were called out to maintain order, and they managed to disperse the crowd without any fatalities. Another 1,000 or so National Guard troops were sent in the next day to keep the peace. Philadelphia avoided the death and destruction of Pittsburgh, but the upper classes were profoundly shaken. One of the legacies of this period of labor unrest are the city armories. During the Gilded Age, Philadelphia built 6 fortress-like armories for National Guard troops. These buildings were funded almost exclusively by private money and were intended to protect business interests against striking workers. The armory on 23rd Street still stands near Chestnut Street. It looks like a medieval castle, with its thick masonry walls, crenellated towers, and massive entry doors. Its design expresses the fear of the upper classes, who were preparing to defend themselves in case of a class war. But this wasn't all. Those in power were building up legal defenses as well. They sought to control the poor and working classes in the Gilded Age by policing their behavior in the street. City and state governments began to revive so-called vagrancy laws to dictate who could do what in public. These laws had been around since colonial days, and they gave the state the ability to arrest people for being drunk, for being lewd, for begging, or just for loitering in the street. But in the Gilded Age, they were used to police all kinds of marginalized groups and their public behavior. Here's Professor Michael Kahn again to explain.
There was a kind of a new wave of vagrancy laws that was passed in the 1870s. And that reflected a few different anxieties that were going on at that time among the kind of wealthier, whiter Philadelphians. Vagrancy laws are notoriously extremely broadly phrased. It's really a license for police to arrest people who seem to perhaps be unemployed and or are maybe engaging in some behavior that the police find distasteful or disreputable. And these laws are applied, to both white and black people. Undoubtedly, it would have been even more disproportionately employed against African Americans. And these vagrancy laws, many of them remain in place through the middle of the 20th century.
One way that vagrancy laws were used in the Gilded Age was to criminalize homelessness. With all of the economic instability, a large number of workers were forced to live on the streets and move from place to place in search of work, a practice they called tramping. To the working class, this was a necessary response in desperate economic times. To the wealthy, these tramps were terrifying. This rootless, wandering mob could rise up anywhere at any time. They called it the, quote, tramp menace. Here's Michael Kahn again.
People did not understand what unemployment even was. There was just no real notion that there could be a structural issue that prevented people from finding work. So they just assumed if you were not working and you were able-bodied, you were probably lazy or immoral, and you needed correction, hence the title of the house. So people would be sent to the house of correction and be forced to work. I think splitting wood was one of the main things.
For example, the state of Pennsylvania passed a law in 1879 making it illegal for anyone to travel from place to seek employment, or to look for other forms of assistance, like charity. You could only ask for assistance or seek a new job in the place where you already lived. Workers were supposed to accept working conditions in their hometown or face imprisonment and hard labor. This crackdown restricted the mobility of the poor during these trying times and gave the business owners an advantage in dictating terms of employment. And there was a special type of vagrancy law that was developed in the Gilded Age to clean up the streets. These were also very broadly written, and they targeted, quote, unsightly beggars. Many cities and states passed similar versions of these unsightly beggar laws. They made it illegal for a vague category of people to, quote, make an exhibition of themselves and their infirmities in order to earn money. Essentially, if you were disabled and struggled to make ends meet during these crushing economic depressions, it was illegal for you to beg on the street. Not only was it illegal, worse, it was unsightly. There was a belief among many that seeing disabled people on the street, just seeing them, would damage the morals of citizens. They thought it might spread through the city like infection spreads in the body. In order to deal with this problem, the middle classes applied their science of classification to identify the different types of people who begged on the street. They felt they needed to sort them in order to place them where they belonged. They wanted to distinguish the deserving from the undeserving. So some they labeled as beggars were identified as the truly disabled, those who needed assistance and should be sent to an almshouse. Others were deemed to be insane and were sent to an asylum. And many more were found to be frauds, who really belonged in jail. In each case, the end goal was to clear the streets of the unsightly, the insane, and the criminal. The vagrancy and unsightly beggar laws were really used to remove anyone who transgressed what the upper classes considered acceptable behavior on the streets. These laws intertwined with those that controlled indecency, laws against immigration, and laws that segregated and discriminated by race. All of these laws were used primarily against those on the margins of society. This included immigrants, Black people, the homeless, beggars, prostitutes, and the disabled. The laws clearly marked out who the state saw as a threat and who should feel comfortable in the public space of the street. But like so many efforts to control the public in the streets, things weren't quite as black and white as the laws might make them seem. Because there was a fair amount of pushback. Many faith-based groups continued to provide charity without judgment. Women who worked in domestic service were known to give away food or old clothing out the back doors of wealthy homes. And it was fairly common for people on the streets to rally around the, quote, unsightly beggar when the police attempted to arrest them. Men and women physically mixed it up with the police in order to stop them. This became such a common occurrence that New York made a law making this interference illegal. But Philly took a different approach. In 1887, the city passed a law to protect certain kinds of people from being arrested under these vagrancy laws. You couldn't arrest women, small children, or the truly disabled. Though 7 years later, state law overrode this attempt to reduce harassment of the poor and vulnerable. But we can't overlook the resistance of the people who continued to beg on the streets themselves. They refused to be unseen. When in need, they returned to the streets because it was the only place where they could earn some money. It's important to remember that those in power didn't have it all their own way in the streets. Thank you for listening to the Found in Philadelphia podcast. Stay tuned for the next episode about women on the streets in the Gilded Age. If you're enjoying this series about the history of Philly streets, please drop me a review and share the podcast with a friend. And please check out the podcast website at foundinphiladelphia.com. I always publish a companion blog where you can learn more, see some period images, and find a list of my sources. This podcast was researched, written, hosted, and recorded by me, Lori Almond. This episode was edited and mixed by The Wave Podcasting, with music by Nasrality via Pixabay.